This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hello everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and today I'm bringing you a special bonus video, my usual retrospective on a limited format, this time looking at Theros Beyond Death. With Ikoria Lair of Behemoth's preview season just about to get underway and limited review week for the set starting at the end of next week, believe it or not, it seems like the right time to look back at my Theros Beyond Death set review and talk about what I got wrong. I do these set reviews before getting a chance to play with the set, so it is impossible to accurately predict everything. I have now drafted the format about 40 times, so I have a lot more data to go on. In these retrospective videos, I discuss the cards I was off on by a considerable amount, and discuss why it is I was wrong about them. And by considerable amount, I mean that I was wrong by more than half a letter grade. If you don't know what my grades mean, it should be explained in the description below. In all, there are 14 cards that I wanted to revisit, so let's get started. First up, there's White, where there are a whopping 6 cards that I was wrong about. This means that almost half of the cards I was considerably wrong about were white. I'm not sure I've ever messed up so much within a single color. So first up, we have Commanding Presence, which I gave a C to. So I'll say up front that when I was reviewing the set, I definitely tried to value auras more than I normally do, especially because some of them are pretty nice, but I still had a hard time sort of overcoming the concern I have about getting 2-for-1 with auras. And Commanding Presence helps a little bit with that because it gives you a creature token, but it didn't feel like it helped enough. But I was wrong. It just turns out that this format can frequently turn into a format where whoever resolves a powerful aura on their evasive creature first is going to win, and Commanding Presence is definitely powerful. It makes creatures difficult to block even if they're not already evasive because of First Strike and the power and toughness boost, and it makes sure to add to your board over time by giving you 1/1 tokens every time it hits the opponent. And that means you can be racing your opponent and attacking them in the air and making a 1/1 who can chump block and things like that. And it just turns out that it's really good. And in fact, a C means it's a card you'll play most of the time, but it's not going to be one of the better cards in your deck, and you don't want to take it early. But I'm wrong. It is frequently one of the better cards in your deck, and it is first pickable. I think it's more like a B-. So I was wrong, by almost a full letter grade in this case. Next up, it's Elspeth Sun's Nemesis, which I gave a B to. A B is a pretty good grade. That means I think it's a pretty good card, one that you're going to first pick most of the time you see it, but not quite a bomb. But in the end, I think Elspeth does reach into the lower bomb range. I think she's more like an A-. So why was I wrong? Well, I think I fixated on the fact that she can't raise her loyalty at all. I thought about the fact that, sure, you can keep bringing her back later in the game, and that's going to be awesome. A B is a good grade. But it turns out that this format is slow enough and it's easy enough to load your graveyard, even though white on its own doesn't do a great job of it. If you're paired with black or green, it's not that hard to load up your graveyard, even red. And for that reason, it's much easier to escape her like two times in a game than I thought it would be. If you're doing it twice a game, she is going to take over the game. If you do it 3 times, there's basically no way that you lose. And it's not really far-fetched to do it at least once, which means you get 2 Elspeths and multiple human soldier creature tokens and all of that. And for that reason, she's actually a bomb, despite the fact that, yes, she can't raise her loyalty. Her abilities even aren't like incredible or anything, but she's basically a value engine who's just, going to be spitting out a bunch of creature tokens every time you play her, chipping in for some more damage, and occasionally, if you need it, gaining you life. And she turned out to be really good for that reason. Next up, it's Heliod's Intervention. This is the card I was the most wrong about in this set. I gave it a C, which, seems pretty laughable now. A C means you play it, but it's not, not amazing. It's not something you're excited about having in your deck. And I was definitely wrong there. And we'll see on this list that there's a couple other cards I was wrong about because I underestimated just how good blowing up enchantments could be. And, I tried to account for that when I was reviewing the set. I tried to think, there are so many enchantments in this set that these kinds of cards are going to be better than they usually would be. But I didn't go high enough. Like Heliod's Intervention in a regular old set would probably be like a D main board. So I went up a whole letter grade, but it still wasn't enough. There are so many enchantments in this set that getting a 2-for-1 with Heliod's Intervention is pretty easy. And you're frequently going to be able to do more than that. It even blows up some problem artifacts. There are a few of those in this set. And, the gain life part's kind of irrelevant most of the time, but it is some additional flexibility. And while I don't quite think I'm willing to say this is a bomb, it's pretty close. I think it's a B+. It's very rare that you don't at least get a 2-for-1, and when that's sort of your floor, that's pretty good. But again, like I said, put this in a different set without a million enchantments, it's probably a D. Going up to a C wasn't enough. That's just how many enchantments there are in this set, that this moves all the way up to a B+. Next up, there's Bourne, Coarser. So, I looked at this, a 3 mana, 2/4. Those are okay stats. It's something you're going to play sometimes. And I even said, it's an enchantment. It adds 2 to your devotion. Those things matter. But I gave it a D+, which means you'll play it if you're desperate. But I found myself playing it more often than when I'm desperate. I found myself playing this frequently, relatively frequently, and making the cut most of the time, which means it's a C. So there's a few things going on here. One is, again, I underestimated just how important having enchantment creatures would be. I underestimated, the triggering of Constellation. I underestimated as well, adding 2 devotion on this card. And the 2/4 stat line just seems to line up pretty well in this format. It can block pretty effectively, in addition to all the different synergies it's giving you. And don't get me wrong, this isn't something like Heliod's Intervention that's like way better than I thought it would be, but it turns out it's a solid playable, which means it's a C. Next up, it's Revoke Existence, a card I was wrong about for reasons similar to Heliod's Intervention. Again, in a normal set, this would be a sideboard card. This would be like a D in your main board and like a C sideboard card. And because there's lots of enchantments in this set, I bumped it all the way up to a C- as a main board card. But it turns out it's better than that. There's enough targets for this that you run the first copy most of the time in your white decks, and that means it's a C+, so considerably better than I thought it would be. Then there's Transcendent Envoi. So this is another enchantment creature, so I underrated many of those for reasons I've already mentioned. And I also underrated just how good the aura spells you cast cost 1 less to cast thing is. Turns out it's pretty good. There are plenty of games where I've played Transcendent Envoi on turn 2 and then put like Commanding Presence on it on turn 3. Another card that I was wrong about. And doing that is backbreaking. Opponents often can't come back from that. It's swingy, sure, but usually when you're doing it that early, you're going to get a couple of soldier tokens and like 6 damage in before your opponent can really kill your Envoy. And just being evasive in this format is nice. White especially has several nice auras, and this is a great place to be putting them. And in addition to that, it triggers Constellation and various other enchantment synergies. So originally, I gave it a build around grade. I said it would be a D+ in your average white deck and a C+ in a deck that really got there. But I think the floor for this is higher than I thought it was. I think this is more like a C in your average white deck. I think most white decks have enough auras and enchantment synergies to warrant playing the Envoy, and that made it a solid playable. And it means, too, that it might have a slightly higher ceiling. Maybe the ceiling gets into B-, but I think maybe the ceiling is about the same as I thought it would be. C+, it's still sort of not the most efficient creature ever. It's not a perfect card by any means or a powerful card by any means. But it is considerably better on average than I thought it would be. So those are all the white cards I got wrong. Let's move now to blue. First up in blue, there's Bourne Seaguard, which I was wrong about for similar reasons. I was wrong about the white Bourne card. So 4 mana for a 2/5 is not a great stat line by any stretch, but it's another stat line that lines up relatively well. It can block a lot of things on the ground in this format, in addition to adding 2 blue to your devotion and triggering Constellation and various other enchantment synergies. Like Bourne Coarser, I gave it a D+, but like Bourne Coarser, I think it's more like a C. You play the first copy of these relatively often, and you actually feel fine even about playing them if you have enough enchantment synergies or devotion. Next up, there's Shimmer Chimera. So, a 4 mana 3/2 flyer is usually a playable card. It's usually like a C-, maybe a solid C in most formats. And I bumped this up all the way to a C+, because I thought, hey, it's an enchantment creature, and that ability could really be doing some work. Like, bouncing an enchantment every turn if you want to can be some serious business, especially in a world where Constellation exists. And, I was right about that. But what I wasn't right about is just how good and how powerful of a card, even an engine, Shimmer Chimera can be. If you combine it with omens especially, you can just be flashing those in every turn. They're cheap. It's not that hard to get value out of them. Same is true with various other enchantments that have enter the battlefield abilities. You can bounce creatures who have enter the battlefield abilities who are enchantments. You can trigger Constellation over and over again. There's tons of value that can be gotten here. And the floor is still a reasonable creature, a flyer who attacks reasonably in the air. And I think all of that makes Shimmerwing Chimera not a C+, which means it's, you're happy to have one of these in your deck. It feels fine. But I think it's even better than that. I think you can first pick Shimmerwing Chimera most of the time and feel good about it. And that's why I think it's a B. It just turns out it's an engine, and it's not always, but the floor is so reasonable that the impressive ceiling it has is pretty awesome. And Shimmerwing Chimera is one of the better uncommons in the set instead of just, sort of a middle of the road C+. Next, let's move to black, where I only have one card I want to talk about, and it's Agonizing Remorse. So there's a long history of limited not being a great place for discard spells, but what I overlooked with Agonizing Remorse is that it almost always can do something. So it can hit most card types in your opponent's hand, and for only 2 mana, that's pretty good. I mean, if you cast this on turn 2, it's some serious business. Later on in the game, it does have diminishing value, and that's what really hampers most discard spells. But because it's so flexible at hitting different targets in your opponent's hand, and because it exiles them in a world of Unearth, that's pretty nice. But even in a fail case, even in the late game where your opponent has no cards in their hand, you can at least use Agonizing Remorse to exile something from your opponent's graveyard. And in most games, I mean, as I'm sure you know, the graveyard usually has a few things you wouldn't mind exiling in it. So, I've seen some people say that they're like really high on this, up to like a B or B-. I'm not quite that high, but I did initially give it sort of a D+ mainboard grade and a C sideboard grade. I thought it would be a good sideboard card. Turns out it's mainboardable though, and it's even better than a C. I do think it's a C+. I think you basically always want the first copy of this in your black decks in this limited format. Next up is the Triumph of Anax. So I didn't think this would be great. I thought that these first 3 chapters wouldn't really accomplish very much for you, making a creature have more power and trample. I just didn't think it would matter enough. And then, the chapter 4 is where the most powerful thing the card does happens, the fight effect. Your opponent knows it's coming. But it turns out that there are decks that are aggressive enough in this format that using this +X+0 ability every turn can frequently just set up really attractive attacks. Like, basically, I didn't envision the number of advantageous attacks that could be set up by chapters 1, 2, and 3. I imagined those as kind of being throwaway chapters that wouldn't really accomplish a whole lot. Sure, if you have an evasive creature, you do some more damage, but that just didn't feel like enough to me. However, it turns out it is enough. I mean, I gave it a D+ originally, meaning you almost never play it. And don't get me wrong, it's not amazing. You shouldn't first pick it, and you really shouldn't even go after it hard. But if you're in the right kind of aggro deck, I think it's a pretty solid card, and it's a C. All right, let's move to green now, the color where I got the second most things wrong. So first up, it's Mystic Repeal, another card that hates on enchantments that I underrated. I loved the efficiency of it. And again, this would be like a D in your typical set in your main board. And so I gave it a C- as a card you play in your main 40, and a B- as a sideboard card. But as we've seen numerous times already, I think the sideboard grade I gave it is just the right grade. I think Mystic Repeal is actually just a B-. The fact it can deal with any enchantment is amazing. This includes gods. It's incredibly efficient. It's an instant, so you can blow your opponent out sometimes. It is a first pickable card, and you're usually happy playing like 2 of them in most of your decks if you can get your hands on them. It's a nice card. Next, let's look at Nexus Wardens, which I originally gave a C- to. I looked at this and I thought, it's a 3-mana 1/4 with reach. Big deal. We see that card all the time. Even though it has Constellation, which is some additional upside, I didn't really envision it being as big of a deal as it turned out to be. It turns out Nexus Wardens as a 1/4 blocks a ton of common and uncommon flying creatures and ground creatures. It is a real brick wall. It can even, X1s, there's plenty of those in this format, and they just can't attack at all. Nexus Wardens gaining you life is very real too. I mean, a lot of the Constellation decks are grindier mid-range decks, especially if you're in like blue-green, and Nexus Wardens just sort of gains you life while you're, trying to find something to win you the game, and that life is a very real advantage. And I mean, over the course of a game, between blocking and gaining you life, Nexus Wardens can have you at like 8 more life than you would have been otherwise, and, that's not a crazy situation. That's what happens with it a lot, and it turns out to be a pretty effective card in the right kind of deck. And overall, I think it has a floor more like a C+, and I think you really want to find the first copy of this most of the time, especially because green can't deal with flyers very well overall in this format, and it can actually stop them. Then there's Return to Nature, which is our ongoing theme of me underrating just how good mainboard these normally sideboard cards would be. Again, this would have probably been a D as a sideboard card. In fact, we have seen it before where it's been a D as a sideboard card. And I gave it in this format a C-, which seemed like a reasonable leap to me. But, and I gave it a B- as a sideboard card, but I think it has a much better floor than that. I think it's more like a C+. You'll play the first copy of this in most of your green decks. And, it's still a little better out of the sideboard, certainly, but it almost always has targets between problematic cards in the graveyard, artifacts, and, of course, enchantments. All right, so our last card to talk about is Shadow Spear. I like this card a reasonable amount. I loved that it made your creature into a threat in most cases just by giving it +1/+1, trample, and lifelink. I liked how efficient it was at doing it. And, I gave it a grade that says you'll first pick it most of the time, a B-. But it turns out it just lines up really well in this format. It, just is so good. There's enough evasive creatures in this set, there's enough beefy creatures in this set, and all of that really lines up well for Shadow Spear, where it can just make any creature into a serious threat. Even the hexproof ability thing comes up from time to time. I had it come up the one time I managed to beat a Dream Trawler was when I had a Shadow Spear. And it came up a couple of other times too, like against the indestructible lion guy. So, it happens. And in the end, I think Shadow Spear is a pretty legit bomb. It can really take over games. Granted, it's held back a little maybe by the fact that you have to have a creature to put it on. But no matter what, you're going to be getting some considerable value. Even if you're just chump blocking with it and gaining some life, that can go a long way. And eventually, once you resolve something that's a real threat, Shadow Spear makes it even scarier. And all of that, I think, is enough to give Shadow Spear an A-, something in the lower range of bomb. It just takes over the game, and it can do it really quickly. If you get it down early, which you can do if it's in your opening hand, you don't even need big creatures to really put the game out of reach for your opponent. Your 2/2s and 3/3s and putting a Shadow Spear on them is enough early on in the game that your opponent will be in a difficult situation. So, those are the cards that I was wrong about by a considerable amount in Theros Beyond Death. As I mentioned, about a week from today, next Friday, so a little more than a week from today, the Ikoria limited review will begin. The full set will be spoiled. They moved it up a little bit because of the ongoing COVID-19 crisis, and they want to put the content out there for people so they can play on Arena, and that's really cool. So it'll be out a week earlier on digital than it was originally, which means my set review will start a week earlier than it originally would have. And I'm excited to look at all those new cards. As I'm recording this, I've seen literally none of them. So, but it will be really interesting to see the set. So, that'll be starting a week from today. And of course, I'll get some stuff wrong in that too and revisit it much, much later on in the format. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you see my future limited content, including a full set review of Ikoria, don't forget to subscribe. And if you're looking for some draft videos of Theros Beyond Death, you should see the draft video playlist on your screen now. Thanks for watching.